Joining us now to continue that conversation, Texas Democratic Congressman Mark Veasey. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I want to start with what Ilhan Omar said when she returned back home to Minnesota last night. Let's play a clip of that.
Okay.
I know there are a lot of people that are trying to distract us now, but I want you all to know that we are not going to let down. I'm going to continue to do the work on behalf of the 5th because you all send me to Washington to do the important work of progressing our country.
So, Congressman, she started to focus on the important work that was necessary on health care, on minimum wage. What should your fellow Democrats be doing? Should they stay on this messaging and defend her, or should they take her lead and move on and focus on the topics?
Obviously, anytime the president says something racist, we're going to defend whomever he attacks, as we should. But Representative Omar is absolutely correct. I mean, we need to remain focused. We passed the minimum wage bill yesterday. Very proud about that. It had been a long time since the bill had been increased. I mean, it's amazing for me to think about when I was sacking groceries in Fort Worth, Texas, at $3.35 an hour, and that the minimum wage is only at $7 something an hour now. That's just absolutely unacceptable. It's ridiculous. We have passed 10 pieces of legislation in the House since the Democrats have been in the majority that would help consumers lower health care costs, help consumers lower prescription drug costs in this country. Mitch McConnell and the Republicans are absolutely doing nothing. They're sitting on their hands. They need to pass that stuff. They'd rather defend the president making racist comments than to actually do something to help the American people with prescription drug prices. And if this court in Texas, this appeals court, decides that they're going to take insurance away from people with pre-existing conditions, that would be an absolute catastrophe. We need to get to work. We need to stay focused. And I really want to thank my colleague, Representative Omar, for really putting it back on the focus that it needs to be.
And while the American people are certainly impacted by the things that you mentioned, this is still under the cloud of these comments this week.
Right,
and you see on social media, people are reacting because they feel strongly about what the president said one way or another. Take a listen to what the constituents said back in Minnesota when Congresswoman Ilhan Omar returned. Take a listen.
What do you think about the attacks against your congresswoman?
Despicable and horrifying, and yeah, it's sad how commonplace things like that are now with this administration.
I think it's really sad that we have somebody like Trump in the White House as a racist. It's clear to me and to a lot of people and a lot of voters that he is a racist, and he's just got a message of hate. And we're not about that here.
It's hard to be surprised. It's easy to be disgusted. It's really easy to be disgusted at the consistent, Islamophobic, racist, sexist attacks from this president against strong, powerful women of color in general, but against Ilhan in particular.
So these voters are saying they are disgusted. And as we heard from NBC's Jonathan Allen, the president is making race, whether it's spoken or unspoken, a central his strategy. Does that mean that you all as Democrats are now going to have to make it a central part of yours in combating that type of rhetoric?
Look, let me tell you something. I want to be 100% clear, particularly to some of the listeners, some of the viewers out there that may not understand why this hits home. I can remember when I was in 4th grade going to 5th grade, and my aunt moved out of the neighborhood that we had lived in, which was all black neighborhood, moved across the boulevard and in an apartment complex, and we were at the park in this very affluent white neighborhood, single-family houses over there, very affluent. And we were playing, and a car pulls up and tried to scare me and my cousin out of the park. N-word, go home, go back. This is a park for white people. And these were people that were old enough to drive, that were scaring kids that were in elementary school. And that is something that I will never forget. And outside of being called the N-word, the worst thing that someone could say to you was something like, go back. And the president needs to talk to people at rallies and explain that to them, that they shouldn't use language like that instead of encouraging them to do that. And so my position is that whenever something like that comes up, we have to do that. The Democratic Party has to be the leader in showing the rest of the country that this is not the way that we communicate with one another. We can have disagreements about race. We can have disagreements about a lot of things that tend to be divisive in this country. But using things like that are clearly racist just has no place in the discourse, and he needs to stand up and be a leader. He has failed in his leadership and his presidency. Like, there have been some historians saying that he's going to be considered the most racist president since President Johnson. He needs to take that seriously, and he needs to stand up.
Well, it's important to note that the president does say that he disavowed that chant when he was at the rally. Of course, he stood there for about 13 seconds and allowed the chanters to continue. But when asked a day later, he said this is not something to support. But even though that echoed one of his tweets, what do you make of the general silence on the other side of the aisle from a lot of senior Republican officials?
I'm not surprised. I mean, they're mimicking, the constituents that they represent in many ways. And whenever something on race comes up, they just want to pretend like it's not that big of a deal, or it's not racist. You're turning it into something racist. And I think that they are scared, that they do not have the intestinal fortitude to say this is the wrong thing, especially when it comes to matters of race. And it's like that back at home. It's always been that way back in Texas when I was growing up, still is that way today. And I'm not surprised that they do not want to step out and say, hey, guys, this is not the right thing. And I don't think that they're going to do it anytime soon. They just simply, they don't have the courage to do so.
Which is interesting, because the story that you shared is a story that's familiar to a lot of people
Absolutely.
Of color, a lot of people even who aren't of color, but who have felt othered in some capacity
Absolutely.
in this country. And it's the impact, right? It's sometimes it's the word, the sting of those words, but it's also the feeling it leaves you with. And this conversation, this tweeting storm and the attacks we've seen this week has also created an interesting question about what it means to be an ally. What should those Republican leaders be saying when they're looking at the leader of their own party? What should they be modeling when it comes to speaking out?
I think that those Republican leaders should look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, for instance. Go back into history. He knew that making sure that people could sit in classrooms together regardless of race, he knew that was not going to be popular, particularly in the South. They knew that opening up fountains at drugstores and people being able to eat next to one another, share the same restrooms, that absolutely was not going to be popular. And he even predicted that there were going to be political consequences to pay, but he still stepped up and did the right thing and showed true leadership to move the country forward. I think that now the Republicans that really want to move their party forward, which would be the best thing for the country, now is the time to step up and say, hey, enough is enough.
While the world is